In the autumn of 1630, the French city of Toulouse was dying. Plague was wiping out entire neighborhoods, and officers of the law kept running into the same strange fact over and over again. Looters were entering the homes of the dead, searching the bodies of the infected, taking jewelry and money, and never getting sick. In a city where healthy people were afraid to touch a stranger's doorknob, 4 robbers spent weeks working among corpses and came out unharmed. When they were finally caught, the judges offered them a deal: their lives in exchange for their secret. The secret turned out to be a liquid so simple it was hard to believe: ordinary vinegar infused with herbs and garlic. This story has reached us as a legend, and historians still argue about whether it happened exactly the way it is told. But behind the legend stands something more important than one incident in one city. By that point, vinegar had already been humanity's tested weapon against rot, disease, and hunger for 7,000 years. And to understand how a sour liquid could help stop one of the most terrifying epidemics in European history, it helps to go back to where it all began. Far from France, far from the plague, in the delta of 2 rivers, on the territory of modern Iraq. Around 5,000 years before our era, the people of Mesopotamia made wine from date palm juice. There was nowhere to store it properly, the climate was hot, and part of the drink inevitably turned sour before its time. Someone, probably by accident, tasted the spoiled wine and found not rot, but a sharp, useful, preserving flavor. Babylonian tablets record the use of this liquid as a seasoning and as a means of preserving food. Even then, people had noticed the main property of vinegar. It kept food from spoiling, in a world where refrigeration would not exist for another 7,000 years. The Egyptians adopted this technology. Clay vessels found in tombs from the 3rd millennium before our era contain traces of vinegar made from barley beer. It was used to preserve meat and fish in the hot climate of the Nile Valley, where ordinary food could rot within hours. Vinegar became the line between hunger and survival for an entire civilization, long before anyone understood why acid killed bacteria. In ancient Greece, vinegar became part of daily life to the point that people drank it as an everyday beverage. A mixture of water, vinegar, and honey was called oxycrat and was stored in special jars. Farmers in the fields and travelers on the road drank it because diluted vinegar quenched thirst better than standing water of questionable quality. The physician Hippocrates, whose name is attached to the oath taken by modern doctors, prescribed vinegar to patients for healing wounds and reducing fever. He did not know the word antiseptic, but he saw that wounds treated with vinegar healed faster than untreated ones, and he recorded this as a medical fact of his time. The Romans took this practice to the scale of an entire military machine. Legionaries received a daily ration that included vinegar diluted with water, roughly 1 part vinegar to 4 parts water. This drink was called posca, and it was consumed not only by ordinary soldiers, but also by officers, including Cato the Elder, who, according to Plutarch, would call for vinegar during military campaigns when his thirst became unbearable. The reason was practical rather than symbolic. Water on the march was often contaminated with bacteria, and the acidity of vinegar suppressed a significant portion of these microorganisms long before humanity even knew bacteria existed. Diluting vinegar with water also doubled the volume of the liquid ration at minimal cost, which, for a Roman army supplying hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Mediterranean, was a matter of logistics, not taste. The military writer Vegetius directly described the vinegar ration as a standard part of the legion's supply. This was the very drink that, according to the Gospels, was offered to the crucified Jesus Christ, not as mockery, but as the beverage the soldiers themselves drank every day while on duty. Vinegar in Rome reached far beyond the military camp. Every festive table held a separate bowl of vinegar for dipping bread. And it was in this luxurious, spoiled setting that vinegar played one of the most theatrical roles in the history of antiquity. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder describes a banquet held by Cleopatra for Mark Antony. The queen had made a wager with him over who could host the more expensive dinner, and the next day, when her turn came, the servants brought to the table a single vessel filled with vinegar. Cleopatra removed one of the two most valuable pearls in the world from her ear, dropped it into the bowl, and once it had dissolved, drank the mixture. She was about to repeat the trick with the second pearl, but the referee of the wager stopped her and declared Antony the loser. Modern researchers have tried to recreate this experiment literally. A whole pearl does not dissolve in ordinary vinegar within seconds. It takes several days, even if the vinegar is heated. This means either Pliny was writing for dramatic effect 100 years after Cleopatra's death, or the pearl had been crushed or prepared beforehand. Historians admit it is impossible to prove that this exact dramatic moment happened as described. But the underlying fact that vinegar can break down the calcium carbonate that makes up pearls is chemically confirmed. And the legend knew this 2,000 years before chemistry existed as a science. By the Middle Ages, vinegar had turned from a household liquid into a strategic commodity. The French city of Orleans became a production center so influential that in 1394, local vinegar makers founded their own guild. Guild members kept their method of continuous fermentation under strict secrecy, on penalty of expulsion. Their technique, later called the Orleans method, allowed vinegar of consistent quality to be produced on an industrial scale, and for centuries, the city became synonymous with the finest vinegar in Europe. It was during this period that scarcity became a matter of life and death. As plagues swept through European cities one after another, physicians had no idea what caused the disease. They noticed one pattern: people who worked with strong-smelling substances, tanners, gravediggers, vinegar merchants, seemed to fall ill less often than everyone else. This gave rise to a practice used by the real plague doctors of the era. Their famous beaked masks were stuffed with herbs, and the cloth pressed against the mouth was often soaked in vinegar to filter the foul-smelling air, which people at the time believed carried the disease. No one understood microbiology. But vinegar does have genuine antibacterial properties, and this accidental protection, born out of fear, turned out not to be entirely pointless. It was against this backdrop that the story of the four thieves, the one this account opened with, took shape. According to the legend, later recorded by the French herbalist Jean Valnet, the protective recipe included vinegar, garlic, wormwood, rosemary, and other herbs, which the robbers reportedly rubbed onto their skin before entering infected homes. Historians have found no confirmation that events unfolded exactly as the story is retold generation after generation. And even the date and city shift from version to version: Marseille or Toulouse, the 14th century or the 17th. This is not a documented historical fact, but a piece of folklore that gathered detail over the centuries. Still, there is a plausible kernel of truth in it. Garlic and many of the herbs in the recipe do have genuine antimicrobial properties, and vinegar would have helped draw those active compounds into a liquid that was easy to apply to the skin. The legend outlived the plague by 400 years precisely because behind it stood a real, if accidentally discovered, benefit. And yet, for all this practical use, no one in those centuries understood where vinegar actually came from. Wine seemed to turn sour on its own, and winemakers feared the process as spoilage rather than understood it as a separate production method. A cloudy, slimy film would appear on the surface of the fermenting liquid, known as the vinegar mother, and no one could explain where it came from. Some scholars considered the transformation of wine into vinegar a purely chemical process. Others suspected a living organism was involved, but no one could confirm either theory for 2 centuries. The answer finally came in 1864, and it arrived not out of the ordinary curiosity, but out of state necessity. French winemaking was losing enormous sums of money because part of the wine, on its way to buyers, spoiled into low-quality vinegar through no fault of the producers. Emperor Napoleon III assigned the problem to a young chemist named Louis Pasteur. Pasteur took a microscope and found what had eluded winemakers for centuries. The film on the surface of soured wine turned out to be a colony of living microorganisms, which he named Mycoderma aceti. These organisms fed on oxygen from the air and converted the wine's alcohol into acetic acid through a process now known as oxidation. Pasteur proved that the transformation of wine into vinegar was not spoilage or accident, but the work of specific living bacteria that could be controlled, cultivated, and used deliberately. This discovery changed more than just vinegar production. It laid the groundwork for an entire science of microorganisms and became one of the steps on Pasteur's path toward his most famous invention, the process of pasteurization, which today protects billions of people from spoiled milk and other foods. Vinegar, a liquid accidentally discovered in Mesopotamia, turned out to be the very substance on which modern microbiology was built. Today, vinegar is far more than a condiment for a salad. Millions of tons of acetic acid are produced around the world every year, and only a small fraction of that volume ends up in a bottle on a kitchen shelf. Acetic acid serves as a raw material for plastics, paints, textile fibers, and solvents. In the food industry, it remains one of the most reliable natural preservatives, extending the shelf life of products without complex chemistry. In agriculture, vinegar is used as a safer alternative to herbicides on organic farms. Medical research in recent decades has examined the effect of acetic acid on blood sugar levels after meals, though scientists stress that the effect is modest and does not replace prescribed treatment. From an accidentally soured date wine in Mesopotamia to Pasteur's microscope, nearly 7,000 years passed, and through all of it, the same simple acid kept saving people in ways they did not fully understand themselves. Roman soldiers drank it so they would not fall ill from contaminated water on the march. Medieval physicians pressed cloth soaked in it to their faces, hoping to hold back a plague whose cause they knew nothing about. 4 robbers, according to legend, evaded death by rubbing a vinegar infusion into their skin. And when a man with a microscope finally appeared who could explain what was happening inside fermenting wine, it turned out that all of that centuries-old practical wisdom had rested on a colony of tiny bacteria that no one before Pasteur had ever seen, but whose effects humanity had been relying on blindly for thousands of years.